The Ruined Colony. 26 years ago, while studying glaciation on the slope of Long's Peak, I came upon a cluster of 8 beaver houses. These crude conical mud huts were in a forest pond far up on the mountainside. In this colony of our first engineers were so many things of interest that the fascinating study of the dead Ice King's ruins and records was indefinitely given up in order to observe citizen beavers' works and ways. A pile of granite boulders on the edge of the pond stood several feet above the water level, and from the top of these the entire colony and its operations could be seen. On these I spent days observing and enjoying the autumnal activities of beaverdom. It was the busiest time of year for these industrious folk. General and extensive preparations were now being made for the long winter amid the mountain snows. A harvest of scores of trees was being gathered, and work on a new house was in progress, while the old houses were receiving repairs. It was a serene autumn day when I came into the picturesque village of these primitive people. The aspens were golden, the willows rusty, the grass tanned, and the pines were purring in the easy air. The colony site was in a small basin amid morainal debris at an altitude of 9,000 feet above the sea level. I at once christened it the Moraine Colony. The scene was utterly wild. Peaks of crags and snow rose steep and high above all around crowded a dense evergreen forest of pine and spruce. A few small swamps reposed in this forest, while here and there in it bristled several gigantic windrows of boulders. A ragged belt of aspens surrounded the several ponds and separated the pines and spruces from the fringe of water-loving willows along the shores. There were 3 large ponds in succession, and below these a number of smaller ones. The dams that formed the large ponds were willow-grown, earthy structures about 4 feet in height and all sagged downstream. The houses were grouped in the middle pond, the largest one, the dam of which was more than 300 feet long. 3 of these lake dwellings stood near the upper margin, close to where the brook poured in. The other 5 were clustered by the outlet, just below which a small willow-grown, boulder-dotted island lay between the divided waters of the stream. A number of beavers were busy gnawing down aspens, while others cut the felled ones into sections, pushed and rolled the sections into the water, and then floated them to the harvest piles, one of which was being made beside each house. Some were quietly at work spreading a coat of mud on the outside of each house. This would freeze and defy the tooth and claw of the hungriest or the strongest predaceous enemy. 4 beavers were leisurely lengthening and repairing a dam. A few worked singly, but most of them were in groups. All worked quietly and with apparent deliberation, but all were in motion, so that it was a busy scene. To work like a beaver! What a stirring exhibition of beaver industry and forethought I viewed from my boulder pile. At times, upward of 40 of them were in sight. Though there was a general cooperation, yet each one appeared to do his part without orders or direction. Time and again, a group of workers completed a task and without pause silently moved off and began another. Everything appeared to go on mechanically. It produced a strange feeling to see so many workers doing so many kinds of work effectively and automatically. Again and again I listened for the superintendent's voice. Constantly I watched to see the overseer move among them, but I listened and watched in vain. Yet I feel that some of the patriarchal fellows must have carried a general plan of the work, and that during its progress orders and directions that I could not comprehend were given from time to time. The work was at its height a little before midday. Nowadays it is rare for a beaver to work in daylight. Men and guns have prevented daylight workers from leaving descendants. These not only worked, but played by day. One morning, for more than an hour, there was a general frolic, in which the entire population appeared to take part. They raced, dived, crowded in general mix-ups, whacked the water with their tails, wrestled, and dived again. There were 2 or 3 play centers, but the play went on without intermission, and as their position constantly changed, the merrymakers splashed water all over the main pond before they calmed down and in silence returned to work. I gave most attention to the harvesters, who felled the aspens and moved them, bodily or in sections, by land and water to the harvest piles. One tree on the shore of the pond, which was felled into the water, was 8 inches in diameter and 15 feet high. Without having even a limb cut off, it was floated to the nearest harvest pile. Another, about the same size, which was procured some 50 feet from the water, was cut into 4 sections and its branches removed. Then a single beaver would take a branch in his teeth, drag it to the water, and swim with it to a harvest pile. But 4 beavers united to transport the largest section to the water. They pushed with 4 paws, with breasts, and with hips. Plainly, it was too heavy for them. They paused. Now they will go for help, I said to myself, and I shall find out who the boss is. But to my astonishment, one of them began to gnaw the piece in 2, and 2 more began to clear a narrow way to the water, while the 4th set himself to cutting down another aspen. Good roads and open waterways are the rule, and perhaps the necessary rule, of beaver colonies. I became deeply interested in this colony, which was situated within 2 miles of my cabin, and its nearness enabled me to be a frequent visitor and to follow closely its fortunes and misfortunes. About the hut-filled pond I lingered when it was covered with winter's white, when fringed with gentian's blue, and while decked with the pond lily's yellow glory. Fire ruined it during an autumn of drought. One morning, while watching from the boulder pile, I noticed an occasional flake of ash dropping into the pond. Soon smoke scented the air. Then came the awful and subdued roar of a forest fire. I fled, and from the timberline watched the storm cloud of black smoke sweep furiously forward, bursting and closing to the terrible leaps of red and tattered flames. Before noon, several thousand acres of forest were dead. All leaves and twigs were in ashes, all tree trunks blistered and blackened. The moraine colony was closely embowered in a pitchy forest. For a time, the houses in the water must have been wrapped in flames of smelter heat. Could these mud houses stand this? The beavers themselves, I knew, would escape by sinking under the water. Next morning, I went through the hot, smoky area and found every house cracked and crumbling. Not one was inhabitable. Most serious of all was the total loss of the uncut food supply when harvesting for winter had only begun. Would these energetic people starve at home, or would they try to find refuge in some other colony? Would they endeavor to find a new grove that the fire had missed and there start anew? The intense heat had consumed almost every fibrous thing above the surface. The piles of garnered green aspen were charred to the waterline. All that remained of willow thickets and aspen groves were thousands of blackened pickets and points, acres of coarse charcoal stubble. It was a dreary, starving outlook for my furred friends. I left the scene to explore the entire burned area. After wandering for hours amid ashes and charcoal, seeing here and there the seared carcass of a deer or some other wild animal, I came upon a beaver colony that had escaped the fire. It was in the midst of several acres of swampy ground that was covered with fire-resisting willows and aspens. The surrounding pine forest was not dense, and the heat it produced in burning did no damage to the scattered beaver houses. From the top of a granite crag, I surveyed the green scene of life and the surrounding sweep of desolation. Here and there a sodden log smoldered in the ashen distance and supported a tower of smoke in the still air. A few miles to the east, among the scattered trees of a rocky summit, the fire was burning itself out. To the west, the sun was sinking behind crags and snow. Nearby, on a blackened limb, a southbound robin chattered volubly but hopelessly. While I was listening, thinking, and watching, a mountain lion appeared and leaped lightly upon a block of granite. He was on my right, about 100 feet away, and about an equal distance from the shore of the nearest pond. He was interested in the approach of something. With a nervous switching of his tail, he peered eagerly forward over the crown of the ridge just before him, and then crouched tensely and expectantly upon his rock. A pine tree that had escaped the fire screened the place toward which the lion looked and where something evidently was approaching. While I was trying to discover what it could be, a coyote trotted into view. Without catching sight of the nearby lion, he suddenly stopped and fixed his gaze upon the point that so interested the crouching beast. The mystery was solved when 30 or 40 beavers came hurrying into view. They had come from the ruined moraine colony. I thought to myself that the coyote, stuffed as he must be with the seared flesh of fire-roasted victims, would not attack them, but a lion wants a fresh kill for every meal, and so I watched the movements of the latter. He adjusted his feet a trifle and made ready to spring. The beavers were getting close, but just as I was about to shout to frighten him, the coyote leaped among them and began killing. In the excitement of getting off the crag, I narrowly escaped breaking my neck. Once on the ground, I ran for the coyote, shouting wildly to frighten him off, but he was so intent upon killing that a violent kick in the ribs first made him aware of my presence. In anger and excitement, he leaped at me with ugly teeth as he fled. The lion had disappeared, and by this time the beavers in the front ranks were jumping into the pond, while the others were awkwardly speeding down the slope. The coyote had killed 3. If beavers have a language, surely that night the refugees related to their hospitable neighbors some thrilling experiences. The next morning I returned to the moraine colony over the route followed by the refugees. Leaving their fire-ruined homes, they had followed the stream that issued from their ponds. In places, the channel was so clogged with fire wreckage that they had followed alongside the water rather than in it, as is their wont. At one place, they had hurriedly taken refuge in the stream. Coyote tracks in the scattered ashes explained this, but after going a short distance, they had climbed from the water and again traveled the ashy earth. Beavers commonly follow water routes, but in times of emergency or in moments of audacity, they will journey overland. To have followed this stream down to its first tributary, then up this to where the colony in which they found refuge was situated, would have required 4 miles of travel. Overland, it was less than a mile. After following the stream for some distance, at just the right place, they turned off, left the stream, and dared the overland dangers. How did they know the situation of the colony in the willows, or that it had escaped fire? And how could they have known the shortcut, best way to it? The morning after the arrival of the refugees, work was begun on 2 new houses and a dam, which was about 60 feet in length and built across a grassy open. Green cuttings of willow, aspen, and alder were used in its construction. Not a single stone or handful of mud was used. When completed, it appeared like a windrow of freshly raked shrubs. It was almost straight, but sagged a trifle downstream. Though the water filtered freely through, it flooded the flat above. As the 2 new houses could not shelter all the refugees, it is probable that some of them were sheltered in bank tunnels, while room for others may have been found in the old houses. That winter, the colony was raided by some trappers. More than 100 pelts were secured, and the colony was left in ruins and almost depopulated. The moraine colony site was deserted for a long time. 8 years after the fire, I returned to examine it. The willow growth about the ruins was almost as thrifty as when the fire came. A growth of aspen taller than one's head clung to the old shorelines, while a close seedling growth of lodgepole pine throve in the ashes of the old forest. One low mound, merry with blooming columbine, was the only house ruin to be seen. The ponds were empty, and every dam was broken. The stream, in rushing unobstructed through the ruins, had eroded deeply. This erosion revealed the records of ages, and showed that the old main dam had been built on the top of an older dam and a sediment-filled pond. The second dam was on top of an older one still. In the sediment of the oldest, the bottom pond, I found a spearhead, 2 charred logs, and the skull of a buffalo. Colonies of beaver, as well as those of men, are often found upon sites that have a tragic history. Beavers, with Omar, might say, "When you and I behind the veil are past, oh, but the long while the world shall last." The next summer, 1893, the moraine site was resettled. During the first season, the colonists spent their time repairing dams and were content to live in holes. In autumn, they gathered no harvest, and no trace of them could be found after the snow, so it is likely that they had returned to winter in the colony whence they had come. But early in the next spring, there were reinforced numbers of them at work establishing a permanent settlement. 3 dams were repaired, and in the autumn, many of the golden leaves that fell found lodgment in the fresh plaster of 2 new houses. In the new moraine colony, one of the houses was torn to pieces by some animals, probably a bear. This was before Thanksgiving. About midwinter, a prospector left his tunnel a few miles away, came to the colony, and dynamited a house and got 7 of them. Next year, 2 houses were built on the ruins of the 2 just fallen. That year's harvest home was broken by deadly attacks of enemies. In gathering the harvest, the beavers showed a preference for some aspens that were growing in a moist place about 100 feet from the water. Whether it was the size of these or their peculiar flavor that determined their election in preference to nearer ones, I could not determine. One day, while several beavers were cutting here, they were surprised by a mountain lion which leaped upon and killed one of the harvesters. The next day, the lion surprised and killed another. 2 or 3 days later, a coyote killed one on the same blood-stained spot, and then overtook and killed 2 others as they fled for the water. I could not see these deadly attacks from the boulder pile, but in each case the sight of flying beavers sent me rushing upon the scene, where I beheld the cause of their desperate retreat. But despite dangers, they persisted until the last of these aspens was harvested. During the winter, the bark was eaten from these, and the next season their clean wood was used in the walls of a new house. One autumn, I had the pleasure of seeing some immigrants pass me en route for a new home in the moraine colony. Of course, they may have been only visitors, or have come temporarily to assist in the harvesting, but I like to think of them as immigrants, and a number of things testified that immigrants they were. One evening I had been lying on a boulder by the stream below the colony, waiting for a gift from the gods. It came. Out of the water within 10 feet of me scrambled the most patriarchal as well as the largest beaver that I have ever seen. I wanted to take off my hat to him. I wanted to ask him to tell me the story of his life, but from long habit I simply lay still and watched and thought in silence. He was making a portage round a cascade. As he scrambled up over the rocks, I noticed that he had but 2 fingers on his right hand. He was followed in single file by 4 others. One of these was minus a finger on the left hand. The next morning, I read that 5 immigrants had arrived in the moraine colony. They had registered their footprints in the muddy margin of the lower pond. Had an agent been sent to invite these colonists, or had they come out of their own adventurous spirit? The day following their arrival, I trailed them backward in the hope of learning whence they came and why they had moved. They had traveled in the water most of the time, but in places they had come out on the bank to go round a waterfall or to avoid an obstruction. Here and there I saw their tracks in the mud and traced them to a beaver settlement in which the houses and dams had been recently wrecked. A nearby rancher told me that he had been, quote, making it hot for all beavers in his meadow. During the next 2 years, I occasionally saw this patriarchal beaver or his tracks thereabout. It is the custom among old male beavers to idle away 2 or 3 months of each summer in exploring the neighboring brooks and streams, but they never fail to return in time for autumn activities. It thus becomes plain how, when an old colony needs to move, someone in it knows where to go and the route to follow. The moraine colonists gathered an unusually large harvest during the autumn of 1909. 732 sapling aspens and several hundred willows were massed in the main pond by the largest house. This pile, which was mostly below the water line, was 3 feet deep and 124 feet in circumference. Would a new house be built this fall? This unusually large harvest plainly told that either children or immigrants had increased the population of the colony. Of course, a hard winter may also have been expected. No, they were not to build a new house, but the old house by the harvest pile was to be enlarged. One day, just as the evening shadow of Long's Peak had covered the pond, I peeped over a log on top of the dam to watch the work. The house was only 40 feet distant. Not a ripple stirred among the inverted peaks and pines in the clear, shadow-enameled pond. A lone beaver rose quietly in the scene from the water near the house. Swimming noiselessly, he made a circuit of the pond. Then, for a time, and without any apparent purpose, he swam back and forth over a short, straight course. He moved leisurely and occasionally made a shallow, quiet dive. He did not appear to be watching anything in particular or to have anything special on his mind. Yet his eyes may have been scouting for enemies, and his mind may have been full of house plans. Finally, he dived deeply, and the next I saw of him, he was climbing up the side of the house addition with a paw full of mud. By this time, a number of beavers were swimming in the pond after the manner of the first one. Presently, all began to work. The addition already stood more than 2 feet above the water line. The top of this was crescent-shaped and was about 7 feet long and half as wide. It was made mostly of mud, which was plentifully reinforced with willow cuttings and aspen sticks. For a time, all the workers busied themselves in carrying mud and roots from the bottom of the pond and placing these on the slowly rising addition. 11 were working at one time. By and by, 3 swam ashore, each in a different direction and each a few seconds apart. After a minute or two, they returned from the shore, each carrying or trailing a long willow. These were dragged to the top of the addition, laid down, and trampled in the mud. Meantime, the mud carriers kept steadily at their work. Again willows were brought, but this time 4 beavers went, and as before, each was independent of the others. I did not see how this work could go on without someone bossing the thing, but I failed to detect any beaver acting as overseer. While there was general cooperation, each acted independently most of the time and sometimes was apparently oblivious of the others. These beavers simply worked, slowly, silently, and steadily, and they were still working away methodically and with dignified deliberation when darkness hid them.